Welcome. I'm Deborah Nelson. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Fund for Investigative Journalism. I'm on their advisory board, also on faculty at University of Maryland. And on behalf of the Native American Journalists Association, welcome to Impact Investigations, Localizing the Land Grab University Story. We are going to hear from Tristan Ahtone and Robert Lee about that investigation, which published in High Country News last year. They'll tell us what they found, how they did it, and how other reporters can access the data for their local stories. Tristan is now editor-in-chief of Texas Observer, and he's a former associate editor for High Country News. Robert Lee is a lecturer in American history at the University of Cambridge, and notably earned his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, a land-grant university that we'll be hearing more about. And then we'll hear from Katelyn Vue about how she covered the story on her campus for the Minnesota Daily at the University of Minnesota. And after that, we'll field questions. So please feel free to post them in the chat anytime during the presentation and afterwards. And then we'll kind of take them in order. So Tristan and Robert, you want to take it from here?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about this story. It's a real honor. So we are going to talk about sort of give you an overview of the story, as well as some of the practical use of the platforms that we've built around the land grab investigation. We do this at a lot of our presentations, is that if you are tweeting, we've been using the LandGrabU hashtag so that we can kind of aggregate stories and thoughts and hot takes on the subject. Makes it easy for us to sort of check out what the conversations are around the work. But this is the sort of splash page from our Land Grab University story. And sort of in a nutshell, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. And the story that we've learned around the Morrill Act is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land to bring education to the masses. But as our investigation reveals, the truth is a bit more complicated. The Morrill Act works by turning expropriated indigenous land into seed money for higher education. And in all, the act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land for more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 universities. But the Morrill Act's footprint is broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land scattered across 24 states, making research and reporting on its impacts just nearly impossible. However, through our 2-year investigation supported by the Fund for Investigative Journalism, we've been able to identify and map those 80,000 individual land parcels in order to better understand the relationship between higher education and violent colonialism. When combined, those scattered parcels represent an area approximately the size of Denmark, and our reporting provides a window into how universities profited from dispossession and genocide. But it also offers opportunities for additional reporting, research, and collaboration to really further the investigative work that this project has kicked off. So we'll discuss more about that in detail, and but first I'll toss it over to Bobby to talk more about the Morrill Act and how this project came to be.
Thanks, Tristan. Thanks so much for having us. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of background on the project and provide some additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862 itself, as well as our approach to investigating it. Now, the indigenous sources of university land has been an emerging issue in maybe the last 5 years or so. And the springboard has really been studies of slavery and the university, which many of you might have seen in the press in various places. On this issue, we saw, for example, in 2014, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, flagged the topic. There have been cultural theorists who have discussed it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. Some of the people that we interviewed for the story, Sharon Stein and Margaret Nash, have framed the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from indigenous nations to expand the agricultural and mechanical education available to settlers. And they sort of started to unpack how it worked a little bit. There have also been some efforts of places like UMass and Virginia Tech to map the Morrill Act footprint of these individual schools and look at its relationship to indigenous nations. But those projects ran into some technical snags. Neither was complete. There have been some other schools that were also trying to understand geospatially their Morrill Act footprint, places like University of Iowa, Michigan State, University of Nebraska. They began mapping their Morrill Act parcels in the past few years without connecting them at all or thinking about them in terms of their relationship to the land's original owners and caretakers. And there's lots more recent or sort of current work on the way about this issue. All of that is sort of a long way to say that it's a really exciting time to be thinking about what was until recently almost entirely neglected issue in both scholarship, in public memory of land-grant universities, and in the press. So there are a lot of opportunities to do additional detailed reporting on this issue. So where did the high country news collaboration come into this emerging field? We started out in 2018. Tristan and I were both on fellowships at the same university, which is fortunate because Tristan's a journalist. I'm a historian by trade. We sort of run in different circles. When the project came together, the idea was to unspool the Morrill Act not completely, to not just identify the parcels that benefited a single university or were located in a single state or connected to a single indigenous nation, but to locate all of them insofar as that was possible, and to track down the indigenous origins of every single one of these parcels in order to gain a sense of the enormity, a sort of big picture view of the wealth transfer. That's a really key idea here, the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed, taking resources from indigenous nations and using them to endow universities. And this map that you've been looking at for the past couple of minutes of the United States is the results of that investigation in its most condensed form. But before I get into a little bit more into what you're looking at here, what this map contains, I'll just give you a quick sketch of the Morrill Act itself. Now, land grants for colleges began earlier than the Morrill Act of 1862. The earliest federal grant for a college that I know of was for Jefferson College in Mississippi in 1803. There were land grant state universities like Michigan State, Pennsylvania State universities that existed with land grants before the Morrill Act of 1862. What the Morrill Act of 1862 does, it nationalizes this program, and it nationalizes this project of taking indigenous land and using it to create a support system for universities, for state universities for the most part. The idea behind it and the sort of the tagline that you see associated with the Morrill Act across history is that it created democracy's colleges. It broadened the availability of higher education to the agrarian industrial classes across the United States. It came at a time in the Civil War when the Lincoln administration was very active in converting indigenous land for the uses of settlers and corporations. In 1862, when you have the Morrill Act, it came on the heels of two other large-scale land transfer laws, the Homestead Act of 1862, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which provided this checkerboard grants for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, in terms of the Morrill Act, what you had was approximately 10.8 million acres that are going to be distributed over time to 47 states, which are going to sell and lease or hold on to that land in some cases to raise endowments to fund what is ultimately 52 universities. There's a couple of states. There's 5 states that separate the grant to 2 universities. Most do it to 1. Most of these universities are public universities. like the University of California, where I went. Some are private, like MIT, Yale in the early years, Brown, Cornell. And there are nearly 250 tribes and nations whose land was claimed by the US through 162 different treaties, some of them ratified, some of them unratified, and land takings in order to make this all possible. And when you look at how much the financial imprint, how much was paid for this land, it was roughly $400,000. But I should say that in many instances, nothing was paid at all to acquire indigenous title to this land. And it raised for these universities what was in the 19th century about $23 million. Now, what that equates to is a ratio of sort of a ratio or return of 57 to 1. $57 raised for principal for university endowments for every $1 that was spent to acquire indigenous title. In contemporary dollars, what we're talking about is endowments that were worth roughly $500 million in today's money. And what you're looking at the map is the footprint of this, the nearly 80,000 parcels spread across 24 states, and a means to compare them here. The sort of pull lines that you see on the map are highlighting sort of a few different areas of statistical significance. On the right, there's the Chippewa Treaty of 1837, which contributed more than 1 million acres to 33 land-grant universities, more than any other. There's Gage County, Nebraska in the middle, which is the most densely covered county in the United States with Morrill Act parcels. There is in California, the site pulled out is the site near the Mariposa War in the 1850s. This is the indigenous land cession area with the most parcels on it. And the data we collected enables you to do this type of analysis to sort of see what's going on the ground in different places at different times. I can tell you a little bit more about how the Morrill Act itself worked. We can move to the next slide. Basically, this land was distributed in two different ways. Eastern states got scrip, which was sort of like coupons for land anywhere on the surveyed public domain of the United States. So the example here is Cornell University, and this is why its Morrill Act footprint stretches across many different states across the United States. Whereas Western states, where there was public land available within the states themselves, they were required to select parcels from within their state boundaries. So the University of California, all of its parcels were selected within the state of California. And you can see here in red here, it's not meant to be red, but it's all of the statistical detail that this aggregation of data enables, the number of acres, the amount raised, so on and so forth. We can move to the next slide there. Just sort of zooming in on one of these parcels, something that we do in the story. I should add that all of the maps and infographics you're seeing were done by Margaret Pierce, who was the cartographer for the story. The images were done by Katelyn Goodluck on the right here. But here's one of those parcels, and you can see the accuracy of this data. This is a square mile of land in Tucson, Arizona. It's zoomed in with the satellite view in the middle. The location, the amount paid was 0 to the Apache people for this tract. It raised on average about $2,000 for its land grant university. And if you look on the track itself, here is a site that Katelyn found, the Apache Tears Motel. We can move to the next slide. And this is also an infographic from the story that Margaret Pierce put together that sort of tells you the step-by-step of how the Morrill Act works. So just to go through this quickly, first Congress is going to offer these grants, so states have to sign up for them. Some of the land that's going to be used had already been acquired from indigenous nations. Some would be required in the future. The grants themselves are going to range between 90,000 acres and 990,000 acres. And the size is going to depend on roughly pegged to the population of the state as expressed through the size of the congressional delegation of each state. So Cornell in New York got the most land, 990,000 acres, because it was the largest, most populous state in the 1860 census. Step 4 here is this east versus west binary of whether you had choose land from within state boundaries or whether you got these coupons for land anywhere. Finally, the land was disposed of. Most of the scrip from the east was sold off to speculators who would then go out and select the land. Other places, especially in the West, like the University of California, for instance, they set up their own real estate office within the university that was then selling off these parcels over years or decades. So it could be disposed in a number of different ways. Do we have another slide here? Or I think I should hand it off to Tristan in the interest of time to tell you about the site that we put together for the data that we collected.
Sure. So one of the things that we wanted to do with this project is make the data available to anybody who wanted to do any additional reporting or research, or to even fact check our findings. So if you're not comfortable with using spreadsheets, or you're not a heavy data user, we wanted to make sure that you could still have access to this information in a clear and user-friendly way. So here on landgrabu.org, you have access to all the same data that we have been using with the same level of accuracy. And you can explore all of it through interactive maps. So for instance, here, if we look at the University of California page, it gives you a lot of information: founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received. But most importantly is that you can play with the map that we put together. So Jeff McGee and Cody Leff develop this site and these maps, and what it allows you to do is see the connections between the institution and the land. You can also zoom in and get really detailed, like all the way down to the acre. So you can fly through, or you can even locate yourself on the map. The crosshairs on the side there allow the website to locate you and find out if you live next to one of these parcels, or even on one of these parcels, as our developer Jeff McGee found out during the reporting process. He lives on a parcel in Seattle. You can also check addresses. So you'll see the search function at the bottom right of the screen allows you to check an address and see if it's on a parcel, or you can even check and see what land cession it's on. There's really a ton of information here to play with, and allows you to explore and really construct your own narratives. And you also have the option to play with links to click on state boundaries, university links, or even indigenous land cessions. Obviously, what we've seen a lot of reporters start to use this website for, outside of even land grant research, is to check land cessions and find out what land cessions on or reporting in, or their news organizations are based in. You'll also see that UC provided a statement when we asked for comment, and you'll see that in the stats and whether or not universities responded to our request as well. So when you zoom out, you can see all of the connections to the university. And one of the cool things that you can do for each of these parcels is click on them and go to a page just for that parcel. Essentially what Cody and Jeff have done is created thousands of pages for each of these land parcels. So you can just get an incredible amount of information acre by acre. So from that larger map, you can zoom into here, which is Los Angeles. And when you click on one of the parcels there, you can see the treaty co-signers, when it was acquired by the US, gains associated with it. Again, you can really construct a lot of information from just zooming into those parcels. But the other thing about this site is it works on mobile. So you can actually go there and locate yourself on your phone, which is what our photographer, Katelyn Goodluck, was doing. So this parcel that I've clicked through on here, when you actually get down to it, you find that it's the home of the Directors Guild of America. This is the kind of level of detail that you can use in your reporting. So for instance, you've got private residences in Los Angeles, all the tribes that are associated with it. Went to the state of California for the University of California through an unratified treaty in which the half a dozen tribes that signed were reimbursed nothing for their lands, received no reservations, while the university raised $786 on this. The Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, Washington. The original caretakers were the Duwamish and Suquamish. This land went to Clemson University and South Carolina State University. The tribes were reimbursed about $3.91 for this land. The universities raised $58 on that land. And despite signing that treaty, the Duwamish are still not a federally recognized tribe by the federal government. Then, as you saw earlier, the cornfields in Adams, Nebraska, the original caretakers were the Kaw Nation. It was seeded in 1825 and then sold for the benefit of Ohio State University. $88 was raised off of this parcel, and a total of 93 cents was paid for it to acquire title. Finally, we can also see how communities have treated this land afterwards. So this is Sisseton Wahpeton land in El Rosa, Minnesota. Ceded by treaty in 1851 and sold for the benefit of the University of Minnesota. Now it's a scrapyard and essentially used to just put trash on. And of course, there's still, as we mentioned, even more work that can be done. This summer, we reported that at least 16 land-grant universities, nearly a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres of Morrill Act lands that brought in at least $8.7 million in revenue combined in fiscal year 2019 alone. The other thing to keep in mind is that we only collected data on fiscal year 19. The cumulative revenue from acquisition of this land to present at these institutions is completely unknown. Open for you to report, localize, and of course that data is all available online for you to look at on GitHub, and I'll let Bobby talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. So there are sort of three levels to the project that we put together. There was the story in High Country News, which was our interpretation of the data that we had collected. But as you can imagine, in a story of 5,000 words, we can only cover so much. And that's one of the reasons why we put together the website, which is a sort of a second level to the project, which allows users to explore things that we didn't go into in a user-friendly interface that could be used by individuals or people working on projects in some of the ways that Tristan was describing, to sort of choose your own adventure and sort through the data on the website. But for reporters and other researchers, we put together a third sort of tier of the project, and that is making the data itself open source. Everything we found is freely available on this GitHub page. It's organized in a series of CSV files. These are basically Excel files. If you can use Excel, you can use most of these files. There's also the spatial files. If you have that capability to be able to recreate any of the maps that we have in the story or on the website, and also to create your own custom visualizations using our spatial data that we created, the set that we created for this story. There's a user guide, as you see on the link on the bottom here is the user guide that we put together. That describes in plain English all of the fields, all the columns of data that we have, these 80,000 rows, one for each of these parcels, and what it contains, how it relates to the other data within the data set. And there are some other documents in there as well. So it's all documented for use. It's available for use, and we are encouraging anyone who would like to dig in here. If we go to the next slide, you can just get a sense of this is the user guide that we put together. It's about 20 pages, but it's keyed into all the different files that you can download, and you can look at exactly what's in there. There's some that, there's the raw data that's organized in the way that we put it together in order to construct the geodatabase that powers the website. There's also some summaries, some useful summary data sets intended for researchers and investigators who might be interested in looking at summary data about a specific university or an indigenous nation or a state, and we took out the sort of intermediary steps of searching through the data in order to put together what could be some sort of useful overview data points to understand the contours of the Moral Act footprint for different groups. If we go to the next slide, you can just get a sense of, if you open this on your desktop, this is what it looks like on mine. When you look at the partial data, this is about 79,000, 80,000 rows. There's all the data that's on the website. There's also additional data in here. Not everything that is on the website. There's more in the master data set than there is on the site itself. So it's worth really sort of rooting around in and taking a look and seeing what types of information might be useful for you. We have information about who acquired this land, the patentees of the land, what were their names. You could look at information like that and really think on a micro level. Whereas in our version of the story, we were really looking at a macro level. But I think I should turn it over to hear about what Katelyn has been doing and how this data can be used for additional reporting.
Yeah, so that brings us to Katelyn Vue. If you have joined us late, I just want to let you know that we'd like you to put your questions in the chat and we'll field them after the presentations. So now we'll hear from Katelyn about how after the investigation ran, she covered the story at the University of Minnesota. Katelyn.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk and talk about the story that I did and kind of an overview of how I did it. So I think it's good to just start with talking about how I found the story. And on social media, I follow a lot of different Facebook pages of university departments, cultural centers, and student groups. And I saw that on one of the pages, they shared the article Land Grab Universities. And what really caught my eye was the headline. And I looked into it deeper, reading through a lot of the research and the data. And I was really impressed by how well written it was and how it captured a lot of detail, like showing the actual images. So I had heard the term land grant institution be used all the time during my first year in college, but I never really understood what that meant. And when I was reading this article, it was clear to me what that impact looked like on the university. So, I was interested in learning more, and I thought it would be a great story to pitch because it had this direct connection to the U. And from there, I knew that there was more that I could learn from how this land grab university's article was connected to the U. So what I did next was that I talked to my editors and she gave me the thumbs up to continue looking into it. So the next thing I did was that I went through like different departments at the U to try to talk to professors who possibly knew more and could tell me more information about the relationship in land grant institutions. And some of the people that I reached out to were really kind and forwarding my email or my requests to a lot of experts that they thought would be a good person to talk to. And eventually that helped me land most of my sources, was just through reaching out to people and getting those mutual connections and sharing my questions. But when I first pitched this story, I remember I really focused on the article's connection to the university. And when I went about the reporting, I think you can read from the article that I wrote about the connection to the U. I really focused on three main questions. So I wanted to define what a land grant institution is, because I myself didn't really understand that, but definitely it was so key in building the university to what it is. And the next thing I wanted to know was, how did the university benefit from the Moral Act? I know in the land grab universities article, it did explain like the history behind it, but I wanted to know like, how did the U continue benefiting from it? And my next question was, what currently is being done to honor and acknowledge American Indian people? But in summary, like what I really wanted to make sure I nailed in the story was, I wanted to include the historical context and have enough like have a clear answer and emphasis of how like the Moral Act made an impact on the university today. So that was generally how I covered it. And I'd say that a few tips that I found when I was reporting the story is that it, I mean, it's I talked to my editors, and it was a lot of history to go through, and some articles and some websites that I looked at related to the land grant institution title with the university. It was hard to find like the updated information or trying to make or sort out like what was accurate and current. So I talked to a university historian, which is what I recommend, reaching out to your university archives department and talking to someone there who can really help filter a lot of the information from like the dense history and outline like things in my reporting that are proven right and like things in my reporting proven wrong. And then my second tip is to really understand your university's current relationship with tribal nations. It's so important to really include that historical context and add in the detail of what the implications were, but also talk about the current relationship. Um, I know that on the day my story was due, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council released a letter of resolutions addressing the University of Minnesota, and their list of resolutions really went through like years of requests that they've made to the University of Minnesota, but wasn't being met by the U. So they had like come together, like all 11 tribal nations wrote this letter and they sent it to the U. And I think from the story you can tell that um, that that letter also became a big focal point in the story. But yeah, that's just like a little bit of a general overview. And I can definitely answer more questions about details of how I covered it.
Thank you very much, Katelyn. Really great work. So before we open up for questions, I wanted to highlight 3 excerpts in the story related to response to the findings. The Association of Public Land Grant and Land Grant Universities in a written statement said, while we cannot change the past, land grant universities have and will continue to be focused on building a better future for everyone. Then a little bit farther down, you quote, is it Kucha Baldi, who talks about the inadequacy of acknowledgement alone, and says, now the boyfriend of your roommate feels bad about taking your computer. He has an idea. What if he puts a plaque on it that says it belonged to you? That way, every time he uses it, everyone will know that it used to be your computer. And of course, at the close of the story, you end with, a quote from somebody that said, it says, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you could start today and change the ending. So I wondered if you could tell us what the response has been, your thoughts on those responses, and what sort of response you've seen over the past year. What impact has there been?
I guess I can start off. We've seen a really, really big conversation around the story at this point. So, at the University of Florida, Yale University, and Cornell University, we've seen student governments and advocacy groups demand investigations, protest for racial justice, and petition for increased recruitment and funding for students from tribal nations disadvantaged by the Morrill Act. We've seen advocates use the data to push for free tuition for Native students and the return of land still held by universities. We know that thousands of undergraduates and graduate students at a number of universities are reading the report like in their journalism, education, and liberal arts courses. University of Missouri even made it required reading university-wide for its freshman composition course. Cornell launched a project to document the university's financial windfall. And they're doing some really exciting work in terms of looking at remaining mineral acres because of the way that Cornell went about pulling that land in and supercharging the returns on it. And similar internal reviews are beginning at MIT, University of Connecticut, and at Ohio State, researchers are working with First Nations Development Institute to draft a reconciliation plan to benefit tribal communities whose land ceded the school's founding. So I mean, and that's just sort of, I mean, those some of the big line items there. And I think, I mean, Bobby, you can talk more about this too, but we're happy to see that because we thought nobody would read the story when it first came out. Primarily because it came out right when COVID-19 hit the US and there was no other story in any outlet anywhere in the country. So.
Well, we suddenly all had a little more time to read, maybe.
Could be.
Okay, so we ready to take some questions? So the first question is from Millie LaGrain. Some universities seem to have in-house officers dealing with public records requests. Did you encounter this, and was it a problem?
This might be
an answer too.
This might be a question for Katelyn as much as for us. For the most part, the research for this project was archival. The current administrators at universities, this is not on their radar, or wasn't on their radar beforehand. Because of the way that you think about this funding structure, the Moral Act funding was essential early on, and then it was sort of a victim of its own success as the universities grow, expand, became, mega universities, go from having 20 students to having 20,000 students, and to having other resource and streams for income. The Moral Act percentage for operations decreases. By the early 20th century, this is decreased to very small amounts. By the 21st century, it's minuscule amounts. So these are on the books, but they are not part of, it doesn't appear in the, as a line item in the annual financial report of the university because it's so far buried in the, in the fine print, right? Of what's going on financially. So the way to access this material is through historical methods. This is in archival sources. Some of those are at universities. Some of them are at the state archives because of the way that the program was administered. The land is assigned to the state that assigns to a particular university beneficiary. And then because these are federal land records, the federal government also keeps records of the distribution of this land. So a lot of our material came from the National Archives. So the short answer is we did not work extensively with in-house officers for building the database that powered the story because it was primarily archival. But I think this is going to become very important because of the different scales that you can work at. At the scale that we were working at, I think that that approach was appropriate. But in order to get into the details, especially of what Katelyn was discussing about how to understand how this unfolded at individual universities, what was the long-term impact over time, that is going to be in the university archives to try and understand how these resources were plowed into specific uses that have legacies for the history of particular universities. But yeah, I'd love to hear Katelyn's thoughts on any contact points that she had.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would just add that, definitely when I was doing my research, I didn't really encounter dealing with public records requests from in-house officers. It was mainly through communicating with the university historian through the archives department, and the information of seeing the actual detail of the land at the University of Minnesota and how that was being transferred through the Moral Act. That information was more of when I had to look side by side with what was in the land grab universities article and what the historian was able to provide. And through that, I was able to sort of clarify to myself and in the story, talking more about the detail of, talking more in detail about what land impacted the university. So I feel I didn't really encounter that. And I think it's mainly because I reached out to someone who was able to go deeper into the archives and find that information to kind of help me align with what I knew about from the land grab universities article and what he was showing me. So
It'd be kind of interesting to go back now and maybe put in a public records request for any correspondence or conversation within the university after your story came out to see what sort of discussion it raised.
I can, if you, we know that the Association for Public Land Grant Universities, APLU, had sent their statement that they provided to us to all of the universities in their networks, which is, and a number of them just shared the statement with us instead of actually responding. So we know that there is a conversation that's happening, and a coordinated conversation that was going on at the release of the story and right before it. What the content of that conversation is unclear at the moment. You know, as well, the only other pushback, I think, the only other pushback we got was when we were trying to figure out how much money universities were still making off of land through mineral acres or surface acres. I think it was the University of Kansas was the only university that pushed back and tried to make us pay for it. And we argued with them and then they gave it all up. So that was the extent of the public records request. Get 2 emails back and forth and then kind of gave us what we wanted. But
yeah, it's really interesting that they sent it out to all the universities. I'd be interested to see what university, you of course can't get it from the association, but from the university you could. All right, so does data exist for Hawaii and US territories like the Northern Mariana Islands?
I can take that question, but I'll just add one other thing on record requests. One other likely place to find additional material on the history of the administration of these grants are state governments, and they might have records that they just don't even know about, that they're not on their sort of active radar about how these funds were dispersed, how the income from these funds were dispersed over the years, which is not an issue that we explored in the story, not because it's not important, but because it's enormous. It's imagine, you know, for each one of these different grants has a different history. So to be able to pull it all together for each one would have taken another couple of years. So we were hoping to encourage others in their respective universities or states to track down some of this information, but that could be in state archives where a request might be needed to just sort of to put it on people's radar. Not that I expect it would be difficult to obtain. But as to the question about Hawaii and Northern Marianas Islands, other territories, this is a good question. Some of you might have noticed that we said these grants went to 47 states. And that's because when we sort of structured the project, we said we want to understand the material impact of the Morrill Act. And so we want to understand who got land through the Morrill Act of 1862. And it turns out 47 states did, 3 states didn't. Hawaii is one of those states, Alaska is one of those states, Oklahoma is one of those states. That doesn't mean there aren't land grant universities in Oklahoma, Alaska, or Hawaii, or for that matter, in the US territories, University of Guam, US Virgin Islands, University of Puerto Rico. These are all land grant universities, but their land grant endowment, because they got these later in the 20th century, were direct cash infusions, not through this process of distributing and selling off land. So that's why we don't have data on Hawaii, but that doesn't mean that that some of these universities didn't benefit from land in different ways. It just would have come under different laws, not the Morrill Act of 1862. That's definitely the case with Oklahoma State. That's definitely the case with the University of Alaska. I don't know whether or not that's the case with the University of Hawaii, actually.
Well, in the John Cole, who posted that question, also pointed out that the campuses of the University of Hawaii system sit on Hawaiian homeland. But that's probably independent of the Morrill Act. Right.
Yeah,
so,
it'd be worth looking into how that was structured through the state, how ownership was transferred, what benefits were received. This is one of the the things that the reactions that's been coming out of the story, people becoming more interested in sort of the world of educational land grants beyond the Morrill Act, because there is a wider universe of these grants. The Morrill Act is sort of the marquee, it's the big one, but that doesn't mean there are others.
So Aaron McCormick wondered, where did you get the idea to look into the subject? What sparked it?
So I was as a graduate student at the University of California, I was working with land patents, and the land patent database at the Bureau of the BLM, Bureau of Land Reclamation. They have the General Land Office records, and it came out of the work with that. These are all subdivided by law, and I was trying to understand the origins of real estate on the public domain. You know, you might think, you know, a few years ago, some issues were in the news, you know, with the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Questions were emerging, you know, how did this land become a wildlife refuge? Was it ever sold before? Who did it come from? I was trying to understand those linkages, and I put together some initial research on this for a talk at Harvard, where I was at my on a postdoc. And Tristan was there in the audience, and part of the talk was saying, you know, like, I've gotten to the point where I realize what a big, difficult problem this is. How do we get it out there? Does anyone want to collaborate on this? And that's when this really took off.
I wanted to insert a quick question of my own related to that. So having worked with a historian myself in the past on an investigation, you know, historians and journalists, there are some similarities and differences in the way we approach things. So what were they with the two of you, and how did you deal with them?
Well, it's good. Good question. I guess in terms of the work, I mean, what attracted me to what Bobby was working on was that this is just, in my mind, is just pure investigative journalism. So, you know, being able to work together and work on the project, I wouldn't say there was much of a difference. I guess I don't know. I guess the biggest difference was probably word count, right? What word count and context was probably where most of the struggles came between, like in edits for the most part. But I don't know.
Yeah, in the process of writing the story, we probably had to, you know, iron out some of the real nitty gritty details. You know, trying to think, you know, would your average reader of high country news be interested in this material or be able to follow it along? You know, trying to, maybe we have different ideas of, you know, the forest and the trees when it comes to writing the material. But this story, I think this story was really a natural fit for a sort of academic journalism collaboration, because it has a real purchase in the present, in a way that a lot of other academic research doesn't necessarily have. It has these echoes of conversations about university capitalization in relationship to slavery that has been in the news. I think it was sort of a natural fit. But I think Tristan ran into some problems trying to make this pitch to funders who we needed to get to, you know, pay to construct some of these resources. So that maybe wasn't in the process of creating the story, that wasn't always. I don't think that was felt across the board. Maybe, although I think it's evident now.
Yeah, we had a number of very large outlets that we initially tried to partner with. Just say it's too old, we're not interested, sort of a thing. Like, okay, well, that's sort of an issue there. But I mean, the only other thing I'd add to sort of the collaboration, I think, which made this a natural fit for us to work on, was that you know, especially with the sort of a never-ending conversation around objectivity in journalism, this is a piece of journalism that doesn't come with a view from nowhere. I mean, this is very, very much grounded in, you know, in indigenous experience and views of land and colonialism. And I think that's a big thing that really especially attracted me in terms of how Bobby was thinking about this, that this wasn't just sort of like a let's figure out where all the land of the Moral Act is. It was, as Bobby said, unspooling this knot to say, what are those direct connections between indigenous communities and universities today? How can we pull that line from that point in time all the way to the current, so we can just really see all the way through? And I think that is again the power of that. And seeing, for instance, Katelyn's work on this is to be able to continue to push forward on that too. Is that this is not a 200-year-old story. This is an ongoing story with ongoing impacts, and really has a huge place in terms of just education and how we just think about land and property and settler colonialism in the United States.
And there's a related question. I'll jump ahead just a couple and then come back, but maybe Katelyn, you could start, but if all three of you would. So Taya Trifo asks, how did you decide how much historical context to bring into this story and how much to speak to larger trends of land grabs globally, nationally, and colonialism?
Yeah, I can start. So I think definitely I wanted to include like the historic context that was already in the Land Grab University's article. So I wanted to include that, and making sure that I had written it in a way to kind of seem really connected to the article, and to what was happening and how it was affected now. But so I knew that I wanted to include what was in the article, but also I had done my own research and seen how the university kind of like talked about itself as being a land grant institution. And through that kind of research of like what kind of language were they using to describe it and how were they acknowledging the land grant institution title, I saw that like it wasn't that long ago that they were celebrating the name of being a land grant institution. And through that, it was something that I felt like was important to also include. So there were different aspects that from my research that I like contributed to the article. But it was really with the feedback of my editors, with having that nice balance of including that really crucial historical context, but also talking or also including the voices of different American Indian professors and students that I talked to in the story. So yeah, that was generally how I tried to navigate including the historical context. And yeah.
Yeah. Tristan and Bobby.
I can say a few words about that. I think the challenge, the sort of explanatory challenge in this story was the fact that land grant universities are both widely known. I mean, there are millions of graduates of land grant universities who have heard this word, they've heard this phrase, they've walked by Lincoln statues or Memorial buildings. It's sort of in the air, but it's opaque. You know, people have heard of land grant universities, but you ask them what it is really, they might not be able to tell you. So you have to deal with that, both that sort of, you have to sort of make the familiar strange a little bit. So we tried to explain, okay, what is the Moral Act? How did it work? And how does it relate to a mythic view of the Moral Act that sort of exists and has been celebrated and monumentalized and is sort of in the background of people's understanding. That's the sort of idea of sort of democracies, colleges, and try to sort of unpack that myth. So that's sort of where we started in the story, saying, there's this myth, but really when you understand how the Moral Act worked, it was this wealth transfer. And then give some of the details. Obviously, we didn't give, it wasn't a long treatise on the background of how the Moral Act worked. We sort of tried to, do things like put together that the infographic to try to condense what could have been, a 3,000 word explanation into here are the basics of how this works, so that you can understand what you're looking at when you see this map connecting universities to indigenous peoples through these parcels. So I guess the challenge was to provide just enough so you could understand what the Moral Act is and understand the sort of core claim of the piece that this is a resource transfer that's happening. It's not a gift of free land.
Okay, so did this happen? This is, let's see, from N. Padlosky. Did this happen with Canadian universities? Do you know? University of BC took Musqueam Indian Nation land.
A short answer is I don't know. We do know that there are a number in the Native American Indigenous Studies Association journal that's coming out, I think this spring or this summer. There's a piece that looks at this investigation and does a more global look at where these same processes are happening. If I recall, it was Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. I think Canada was mentioned in there too as well, but this is not uniquely American. It is a very sort of global phenomenon that happened with a number of other colleges. So specifically with that particular university, couldn't say, but it definitely has happened in Canada. So yeah, I mean, one of the things that we learned in sort of reading that intervention piece that's coming out was that how widespread this was across the world, and if we had the opportunity to do it all over again, we would have made it global. But you know, we learned that after the fact.
So another question that kind of goes the other direction, from Stacia Cedillo. I noticed that Texas only had one land grant Texas A&M University. With so many public units in Texas, is there a reason for the lack of Morrill Act LGUs in Texas?
Bobby can probably answer this better, but yeah.
I mean, Texas A&M, agricultural and mechanical. That's what this was all about, for advancing agricultural and mechanical knowledge. Of course, I don't know how many universities there were in Texas in the 1860s. I don't think that there were many. Circa the 1880s, there's maybe about 800 colleges across the United States. So a good number, many more than there are land grant universities. But the short answer is that the state legislatures generally, overwhelmingly, made the decision to funnel these funds to a single university, which subsequently some of them became university systems, and the money might have been split in different ways. There were a handful of states, Massachusetts split it between MIT and UMass. There are a handful of other states that split these awards between two universities. But in general, the idea was to keep it concentrated. And a lot of these universities were founded explicitly to take advantage of this grant. And there were some cases where, there were colleges that were competing over this. In New York, for instance, it wasn't a given that Cornell was going to get this grant. There were other competing institutions in other places as well. You can see that's how it also became the land grant. It's not just the economic benefit directly from the land grant, it's the benefits of being a land grant university, right? Success attracts success. So if you get the land grant, you might be able to get a gift from a city to give you some land to locate the university because they want the economic development in that area, and it sort of snowballs in that way. But the idea was to concentrate the endowment generally with one or two universities. So that's the reason.
But Texas is a really interesting state with it. As you notice, they got scrip when you're looking at the maps there. This is primarily because when Texas enters the Union, they have such a massive debt from fighting and killing Mexicans and Indians that they don't enter with public land. They enter with all of that as private land, so they can essentially pay off this massive debt that they amassed to become Texas. So it's a fascinating sort of like Texas history about how they got away with doing this. As I understand now, Texas A&M just received a fairly major grant to start doing a lot more investigation into this topic, as well as coordinating with other land grant schools that are starting to have deeper conversations about the Morrill Act. And their recent report that just came out on race relations at the school that have begun to create a land acknowledgement that encompasses the Morrill Act, which in my mind is highly shocking for Texas, considering its history and considering the battle that is going on right now just to remove Confederate statues from that university's campus. So it's highly surprising that Texas A&M seems to be taking a lead in investigations.
Well, we've reached the end of our hour. Unfortunately, I want to thank you panelists and thank you audience. An email will go out to all attendees later today with links to everything discussed, as well as the full recording. So, and I encourage you to go to fij.org to learn more about journalism like this and how to get grants, and to najanewsroom.org to learn more about empowering Native American voices in journalism. Thank you.